Everything was ruined by you. Lawrence, my father, slapped the IRS audit notice on the kitchen table and screamed, his cheeks flushed with anger. The papers strewn all over the worn would look like accusations. Melody, 7 years. You fought this problem for 7 years because you couldn't manage basic bookkeeping. I watched in disbelief as my father's rage spread like wildfire across our Seattle house. Standing next to him, my sister Cordelia crossed her arms and shook her head in an all too familiar manner of disappointment. The joyful mood had long since faded, but the Christmas decorations from last week's event were still hanging. I'm Melody Harrison, and I'm 35 years old. I've been burdened for the last 7 years by an error that is said to have wrecked Harrison and Associates, my family's accounting firm. Every holiday, family meal, and phone conversation has served as a reminder of how I allegedly destroyed all we had created together. Dad, I've told you 1,000 times, I uttered in a scarcely audible whisper. I followed the steps precisely as you instructed. How those entries were altered is beyond me. Don't tell me lies. Lawrence's voice broke with passion. In the books, the IRS discovered intentional changes. You were the only person with access to that software, and someone altered those statistics. Cordelia moved nearer, her face a beautiful blend of sympathy and disappointment. We've moved past this, Melody. The audit trail displays your machine, your changes, and your login information. She took out a folder full of papers. We might be able to move on as a family if you simply acknowledged what had transpired. However, I had done nothing improper. I was certain I hadn't. 7 years later, I was still attempting to convince the two individuals who ought to have trusted me the most of my innocence. Discrepancies in client accounts totaling about $200,000 were discovered during the audit. Every finger, for some reason, aimed back at me. I answered, tears welling up in my eyes, I've paid back every penny of those penalties. All of the settlements and legal costs have been paid for by me. Do you need anything else from me? Lawrence's disappointment didn't go away, but his expression did. I want my daughter back. The one who was honest because they genuinely cared about this family. I felt a familiar sorrow in my chest as I gazed around the place where I had grown up, where we had celebrated every milestone and accomplishment. Pictures of our family's accomplishments were all over the walls. In the more recent photos, Cordelia is graduating summa cum laude from her accounting school, Lawrence is getting business accolades, and I am noticeably missing. There was something about the entire event that felt off. However, I was unable to identify it. I had always been the dependable one growing up. I was the daughter who remained late to assist Lawrence in organizing client files and learning the business from scratch, while Cordelia enthralled everyone with her flawless grades and social connections. I truly enjoyed the work, the accuracy of the statistics, the joy of precisely balancing records, and the confidence that clients had in our family business. Lawrence's favorite had always been Cordelia, who was 2 years younger. She was stunning, intelligent, and had a way of drawing everyone's attention to herself. Lawrence literally shone with joy when she received her accounting degree. Now we can really expand the business, he'd remarked. Having both of my girls work with me is everything I could ever hope for, but even in those early days, I observed some things. Cordelia would arrive late, leave early, and somehow avoid the laborious reconciliation work that kept our accounts accurate. Every time I brought up the uneven workload, Lawrence would remark, she's building relationships. She chose to meet with high-profile clients and attend networking events, leaving me to tackle the intricate financial work that really kept the business going. Even though my contributions weren't as obvious as Cordelia's networking achievements, I was proud of my abilities and trusted that they were valued. I had a small but cozy apartment in Capitol Hill where I could unwind after long workdays. That's just as important as the day-to-day operations. I never minded. The changes started gradually in the months before the audit. Cordelia began staying later, often working alone in the office after everyone else had gone home. She volunteered to undertake more of the software updates and system maintenance jobs she'd always avoided before. When Lawrence complimented her renewed commitment, she said, I want to be more involved in the technical side. Melody's taught me so much about how everything works, and I recall being happy that she was finally showing more interest in the vital back-end operations. She asked in-depth questions about our software systems and seemed genuinely interested in learning how everything connected. In retrospect, I realized she was asking about security protocols, backup procedures, and audit trails. During those weeks, we even had some good conversations about accounting procedures and client management. When the audit notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, Lawrence opened it during our weekly staff meeting, and I saw the color drain from his face as he read the formal language about discrepancies requiring immediate investigation. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, and I was happy to share my knowledge with my sister. "They're looking at our books from the past 2 years," he said quietly. "They want everything. Every transaction, every adjustment, every piece of documentation." I felt confident. Our books were meticulous. I double-checked every entry, maintained perfect records, and followed every procedure to the letter. When the IRS investigators arrived 3 weeks later, my world fell apart. They set up in our conference room with boxes of documents and laptops, methodically going through every transaction with the intensity of surgeons examining a patient. I even welcomed the audit as an opportunity to demonstrate how well-run our business was and how naive I was. I cooperated fully, guiding them through our procedures and describing our filing systems. Agent Patricia Williams was particularly interested in our software logs and user access records. She was thorough yet professional, asking extensive questions about who had access to what systems and when. "Miss Harrison," Agent Williams remarked during my interview, "we identified multiple entries that were updated after the initial posting. Can you explain why these modifications were made?" I gazed at the printouts she handed me. The figures were inaccurate, completely different from what I remembered writing. I looked over the documents and said, "I don't understand. These aren't the entries I made. Someone must have changed them after I input the original data." Client payments had been transferred between accounts, expense categories had been changed, and there were changes I'd never made. Agent Williams nodded and took notes. "Our computer forensics team reports that these changes were made using your login credentials from your workstation. Could you explain how that might have happened?" I felt sick to my stomach. I always log out when I leave my desk. I never share my password with anyone. These changes were made on February 14th, Valentine's Day, at 11:47 p.m., according to the timestamp. "Were you in the office that evening?" I was at home that evening eating dinner at a downtown restaurant with my college friend Patricia. I showed her the proof, feeling both relieved and perplexed. Someone else must have used my login somehow, but Agent Williams' expression remained neutral. "We'll need to look into this further." I had the receipt in my purse, the credit card statement, and even pictures we'd taken at the restaurant. "No, I was out that evening. I can prove it." The investigation stretched on for months, with new questions, accusations, and evidence that seemed to point squarely at me every week. "Until this is addressed, we will ask you to abstain from any financial obligations." The financial disparities reached $197,000 across several client accounts, and the computer logs revealed my workstation, credentials, and access codes. Lawrence became increasingly aloof with each disclosure. "How is this possible, Melody?" During a particularly difficult family supper, he inquired. "Who made these adjustments if you didn't?" During those early days, Cordelia was helpful and frequently stayed to provide consolation after our family gatherings. She would add, "I know you didn't do this on purpose. Maybe you were just overwhelmed and made some mistakes. Dad will eventually understand." The question that plagued me as the investigation went on was straightforward: who else could have had access to my login credentials? Someone had purposefully changed our books, and that someone had done so using my access. However, I knew I hadn't made any mistakes. I'd been thorough, careful, and professional. The final audit report arrived on a gloomy October morning, shattering what was left of my relationship with my family. The investigators had determined that the changes were intentional, sophisticated, and intended to conceal missing funds, and I was about to learn that the solution was closer to home than I had ever imagined. Lawrence called an urgent family meeting that night, and I entered his home office feeling like I was about to be put to death. The fines alone would cost the company around $300,000, not to mention legal bills and the harm to our brand. Without taking his eyes off the documents, Lawrence remarked, "The final report confirms it." The room smelled of old leather and disappointment, the same space where he taught me about business ethics and family loyalty years before. Client accounts were intentionally manipulated, with money transferred between accounts to conceal deficiencies. With a mask of carefully controlled emotion on her face, Cordelia sat in the chair across from his desk. "The pattern shows planning and intent," she whispered. "What does this mean for the business?" "The penalties will wipe out the majority of our reserves, and several clients are already discussing leaving, so we'll barely make it." When Lawrence finally turned to face me, I saw something die in his eyes. "Melody, I need to know. Did you take money from client accounts?" he said. "Dad, I would never steal from our clients. You know me better than that." "I thought I did." His voice was hardly audible, but the evidence is clear. "Maybe we should consider that this was a cry for help," Cordelia said, reaching across the desk to gently touch Lawrence's palm. "The computer logs, the timing, and the sophistication of the alterations all point to someone with your level of access and knowledge. Melody has recently experienced a great deal of stress." Lawrence firmly stated, "Cordelia, I didn't do this. The evidence shows otherwise. And until you're willing to take responsibility for what you've done, I can't have you involved in the business." I looked at my sister in shock, pleading for assistance. As he signed the documents, he said, "Actions have consequences. When you're ready to tell the truth, we can talk about rebuilding trust." That evening, he read me out of his will, revoking my inheritance, which would have been my portion of the family business. Over the next few months, the financial strain became unbearable. Since the company was unable to pay the penalties, I willingly took on the debt, refinanced my apartment, took out personal loans, and began working as a freelance accountant to make ends meet. I sent checks each month to cover the business loans, audit penalties, and legal fees. My family get-togethers became exercises in public humiliation, with Lawrence and Cordelia treating me like a criminal who hasn't yet confessed. And every month I felt the weight of guilt and bewilderment bearing down on me like a stone. In front of other family members, Cordelia would remark, "We appreciate what you're doing to make this right. It takes courage to face the consequences of your mistakes." However, I hadn't made any mistakes. Even though everyone around me insisted otherwise, I knew that with absolute certainty. The challenge was proving it, so I started keeping thorough records of every payment I made, every sacrifice I made, and every humiliation I experienced. If I was going to bear this burden, I wanted proof of exactly what it cost me. Receipts, bank statements, and copies of checks totaling more than $200,000 in penalties and fees piled up in the file. The worst part wasn't the money. Rather, it was the loneliness. When news got out about the audit, friends began to treat me differently. I found myself working longer hours, in part to pay the bills and in part to avoid the critical glances and whispered talks. Professional contacts grew distant, and even casual friends appeared to view me with mistrust, as if financial dishonesty were contagious. My modest apartment, my freelance customers, and the monthly ritual of writing checks to pay my alleged crimes had become my entire world. Yet late at night, when the flat was quiet and the bills had been paid, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something basic was wrong with the whole affair. After 2 years of being banished from the family business, I started to see patterns that didn't make sense. Cordelia appeared to be doing well. She had moved into a luxurious apartment in downtown Seattle, started driving a brand new BMW, and taken several costly vacations that she had extensively documented on social media, while I struggled to pay the audit penalties and legal fees. During one tense family dinner, I queried her about her seeming affluence, and she replied, "Business consulting is really taking off." I was aware of the irony when I said, "I've been helping other accounting firms improve their security and compliance procedures." On the back of our family's audit disaster, my sister was establishing herself as an authority on the very issues that were purportedly my fault. She discussed stopping internal fraud and spotting red flags of staff wrongdoing at business conferences. When Lawrence showed us stories that highlighted her experience, she grinned with pride. He said cautiously, not looking at me, "At least something positive came out of this mess. Cordelia has become quite well known." I made myself congratulate them and smile. However, I felt a twist in my gut. My sister was making money off of our family's reputational crisis as I worked 60-hour weeks to pay for fines I didn't incur. That year's Thanksgiving dinner was the tipping point. We were seated around Lawrence's dining room table, which we had used for decades to commemorate family and business achievements. The topic of Cordelia's most recent consulting contract, a prestigious engagement with a significant San Francisco accounting firm, came up. They specifically requested me because of my experience with audit remediation, Cordelia remarked while carefully slicing into her turkey. They want someone who understands how these fraud schemes develop and how to prevent them. Fraud schemes, I said slowly. Is that what we're referring to as our company's demise? Cordelia raised her head. Mid-cut, her knife stopped. Yes, indeed. Evidence of intentional manipulation was discovered during the audit. By definition, that is fraud. And you believe that I purposefully falsified our records in order to defraud customers? There was silence at the table. With the appearance of a man weary of officiating the same battle, Lawrence put down his fork and glanced between us. We've been through this, Melody, he muttered. The proof was obvious. Could we just have a quiet supper, please? But I couldn't let it go. Cordelia, do you inform these firms that the alleged criminal in our instance was never tried and wasn't even formally charged with a crime when you advise them on preventing fraud? Cordelia's calmness wavered a little. The absence of criminal charges does not imply that no crime occurred. Sometimes prosecutors decide not to pursue cases for various reasons, such as insufficient evidence to meet the criminal standard of proof, she said hurriedly. That doesn't mean the behavior was acceptable or that there were consequences. I looked at my sister across the table, examining her face in the candlelight, and something in her tone, in the way she'd responded so succinctly and precisely, brought back memories of the audit, when she'd shown an uncommon familiarity with legal requirements and prosecution tactics for financial crimes. You seem to know a lot about criminal prosecution standards, I said cautiously. Have you been researching this topic extensively? Cordelia's hand tightened on her knife. At the time, I'd assumed she was just doing research to better understand our situation, but now I wondered if there was another explanation. Naturally, I have. Our family firm was on the verge of collapse, and I wanted to know exactly what went wrong and how to avoid it in the future. The conversation continued, but I couldn't stop thinking about her response. Driven by an intuition I could no longer ignore, I made a decision that would change everything that night and began my investigation the following morning. If someone had altered our books using my login credentials, they would have needed access to the office, in-depth knowledge of our systems, and familiarity with accounting procedures complex enough to evade an IRS audit. There weren't many people with that kind of expertise and opportunity, so I reached out to Trevor Yamamoto, our previous IT consultant who had assisted us in setting up our computer systems. And I questioned him about user access logs and security procedures over coffee at a downtown cafe. Trevor stirred sugar into his latte and said, "The thing about your old system is that it kept much more detailed logs than most people realized. Every keystroke, mouse click, and file access was recorded with timestamps and location data. IP addresses, machine identifiers, and even physical location. If the computer had GPS, there would have been much more specific data accessible. But the audit team most likely only looked at the basic login information." My pulse raced. Would that data still exist? That would depend on the backup methods. For compliance reasons, most companies retain archived logs for at least 7 years. However, retrieving them would require administrative access. Over the course of the following week, I studied data recovery and forensic analysis protocols. What I discovered was both encouraging and frustrating. the comprehensive logs Trevor described would, in fact, reveal precisely who had made what changes at what times. But I lacked the technical know-how to access them. That's when I realized something crucial. Cordelia had offered to manage our system backups and archiving processes prior to the audit. And she had insisted on doing so because she wanted to get more knowledge about the technical aspects of the company. I used my old key code, hoping he hadn't changed it, and drove to the office building where Harrison and Associates had once worked. The company had drastically shrunk since the audit, but Lawrence still kept a small office on the second level. The office was dimly lit and quiet. Most of our old equipment had been removed, but I knew Lawrence kept backup drives and financial records in the fireproof safe behind his desk. If the detailed system logs were still there, they would be there. I discovered boxes of backup drives that were 8 years old, each with dates and system identifiers on them. Using a laptop I had brought, I started looking through archived files, my hands shaking as I covered the time frame when the fraudulent entries had been made. The technical data was overwhelming, thousands of entries showing every interaction with our accounting system, but gradually, patterns started to show. The precise logs Trevor had provided showed that the fraudulent entries had been made from Cordelia's computer, using her IP address, from her actual location in the workplace, even though they had been made using my login credentials. The timestamp indicated that someone had used my login from Cordelia's computer in the evening, even though I could prove I was somewhere else. I stared at the screen, not believing what I was reading. More significantly, the log revealed that Cordelia had accessed my password file using her credentials a few days prior to each fraudulent entry. She had stolen my login credentials, used them to make the changes, and then covered her tracks by erasing the clear evidence while maintaining plausible deniability. There was more, though. I discovered something that froze my blood in a folder labeled Personal Backup. It was an unsent email draft dated 3 days before the audit notice, with the subject line, Contingency Plan M Investigation. With trembling fingers, I opened the file and saw the most devastating betrayal of my life, a detailed plan for handling the impending audit and making sure I would take responsibility for Cordelia's changes to our books. The email was addressed to no one and was obviously a draft that she had written but never intended to send. The email started, "I've been careful to use Melody's login credentials for every alteration, and I've erased the obvious traces from the system logs. The changes I made to client accounts should be discovered within the next few weeks. The evidence will point directly to her when the investigation starts." I had to read the phrases 3 times before I understood what they meant. My sister had gradually framed me for her crimes and purposefully damaged our family business, but things grew worse. Melody's personality helps me. She's always been the responsible one, the one who takes blame even when it's not deserved, the email went on. She can't believe her own sister would utterly betray her, so she will bear responsibility for these developments. Her tone of clinical detachment was nearly as damaging as the actual betrayal. She had examined my personality, pinpointed my flaws, and skillfully taken advantage of them. The secret will be to show empathy for her while endorsing Dad's disapproval. I must appear devoted to family while allowing her to further entrench her feelings of guilt and loneliness. My hands shaking as I printed many copies of the email, I realized that the consulting prospects resulting from this audit disaster should be worth at least $500,000 over the next 3 years. This was more than simply fraud. It was a scheme that deliberately destroyed familial relationships for financial benefit. The email concluded with a list of possible consulting clients and speaking opportunities that would be available to someone with insider knowledge of accounting fraud cases. Cordelia had stolen money, destroyed our business, and damaged my reputation because she saw an opportunity to profit from our family's crisis. I felt a bitter rage settle in my chest as I sat in the empty office surrounded by the ghosts of our family's success. For 7 years, I had carried guilt that belonged to someone else. She had intended to base her entire career on the ruins of our family business and my ruined reputation. I had endured shame I didn't deserve, paid for crimes I didn't commit, and watched my sister profit from my suffering, all of which came to an end today. I called Lawrence and Cordelia separately and asked them to join me at his house that evening for a crucial family discussion. I told them I had something important to share about the audit situation. Lawrence sounded weary but hopeful. "Are you ready to tell us what really happened, Melody?" "Yes, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm ready to tell you exactly what happened." Cordelia responded more circumspectly. "What kind of information are you talking about?" "Evidence," I said simply, "documentation that changes everything we thought we knew about the audit." That night, I showed up at Lawrence's house with a briefcase that included copies of Cordelia's email, printouts of the system logs, and a thorough timeline outlining Cordelia's fraud. Lawrence was already seated in his office when I arrived. And I had prepared a thorough financial analysis that demonstrated how my payments throughout the years had surpassed the real fines by over $50,000. "Thank you both for coming," I murmured, as I placed my briefcase on Lawrence's desk. Cordelia arrived a few minutes later, looking professional and self-assured in her business clothes, unaware that her 7-year plot was about to fall apart. Cordelia leaned forward a little as I opened the suitcase and took out the printed email. "I know this situation has been difficult for all of us, and I wanted to share some information that I think will provide clarity." I gave the email to Lawrence first, and as he read it, I saw his expression change from confusion to shock to a deep, hurt anger. "Cordelia," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. The email contained information about who actually changed our accounting records, who actually committed fraud, and who has been lying to this family for 7 years. Please clarify the meaning of this. This was the moment I had been waiting for 7 long years. The truth would finally release me. Within weeks, federal agents revived the case after Lawrence's trusted lawyer verified that Cordelia's email constituted both an admission of guilt and a conspiracy to conduct fraud. Focusing on the correct culprit this time, Cordelia was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. She was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in jail and had her accounting license permanently revoked. When clients found out about her criminal conviction, her consulting firm abruptly collapsed, and she was obliged to give up her opulent lifestyle to reimburse the original victims and pay for court bills. Devastated to learn that he had spent years punishing his innocent daughter while allowing his criminal one, Lawrence gave me full ownership of the remaining company assets and publicly cleared my name in trade journals. When the truth came to light, Cordelia's carefully crafted reputation as a fraud prevention specialist became the target of professional mockery. And she was unable to find employment in any financial industry. To deal with his incapacity to see past Cordelia's manipulations, Lawrence eventually sought therapy. He battled guilt over his partiality and the years of unfair treatment he had subjected me to. As I signed the documents establishing me as Harrison and Associates' sole proprietor, I thought about how Cordelia's worst error had been to undervalue the sister she had attempted to ruin. Even though she had been correct about one thing, I was the one in charge, thorough enough to look into it, tenacious enough to find the truth, and resilient enough to rebuild what she had attempted to destroy. I also realized that sometimes the best form of retaliation is to let someone's own deliberate cruelty serve as the basis for their total demise.